2209 Slod Respondo. While the bombs were still falling over Europe, someone was already counting the money. While the bombs were still falling over Europe, someone was already counting the money. It wasn't a general. It wasn't a president. It was a banker sitting in a quiet office in Zurich, watching commodity prices tick upward on a teletype machine, knowing exactly what was coming next. War, for those who understand markets, is not chaos. It is the most predictable business cycle in human history. This is the part no one puts in the history books. When World War I broke out in August 1914, the global financial system did something extraordinary. It didn't collapse. It reorganized. Within weeks, a small group of private banks and industrial conglomerates had already positioned themselves to supply both sides of the conflict. Steel mills in Pennsylvania signed contracts with the British Navy. Chemical companies in Germany supplied the gas that killed soldiers in the trenches. And American banks, led by J.P. Morgan and Company, began arranging loans to the Allied powers that would eventually total over $2 billion, an almost incomprehensible sum at the time. Morgan wasn't financing democracy. Morgan was financing demand. The logic is brutal in its simplicity. War destroys things at an industrial scale, and everything that gets destroyed needs to be replaced. Shells, rifles, uniforms, boots, barbed wire, canned food, medical supplies, trucks, ships, aircraft. Every single one of those items is manufactured by a company, shipped by another company, financed by a bank, and insured by yet another institution. The moment a government declares war, it becomes the most desperate and least price-sensitive customer in the market. It will pay anything. It will sign any contract. It will borrow at any interest rate. Because the alternative is losing. That desperation is worth billions. By the time the armistice was signed in November 1918, the United States had transformed from a debtor nation into the world's largest creditor. European governments owed American banks staggering amounts. The war had not weakened American finance. It had made Wall Street the undisputed center of global capital. And the men who had arranged those loans, those weapons contracts, those shipping deals, they emerged from the carnage richer than they had ever imagined possible. Andrew Mellon, Bernard Baruch, the DuPont family. These were not warmongers in the theatrical sense. They were opportunists in the precise, technical sense of the word. They saw a window and they walked through it. But here is where it gets more disturbing. In the years between the two world wars, a series of congressional investigations in the United States began to pull back the curtain on exactly what had happened. The Nye Committee, formed in 1934 and chaired by Senator Gerald Nye of North Dakota, spent 2 years interviewing arms dealers, bankers, and industrialists. What they found was not a conspiracy exactly. It was something more unsettling than a conspiracy. It was a system. The committee documented how companies like DuPont, Bethlehem Steel, and dozens of others had lobbied aggressively for American involvement in the war, had spread pro-war propaganda through newspapers they either owned or influenced, and had structured their contracts in ways that guaranteed profit regardless of which side was winning on any given week. Nye himself concluded that American entry into World War I had been driven at least in part by the financial interests of a small group of creditors and manufacturers who stood to lose enormous sums if the Allies lost before repaying their loans. The report was controversial then. It remains controversial now, but the numbers don't lie. Between 1914 and 1918, the profits of United States Steel Corporation tripled. DuPont's earnings increased by more than 800%. Bethlehem Steel paid dividends that would be staggering, even by modern standards. These companies were not anomalies. They were the rule. And when the war ended, their executives did not go to prison. They went to Washington. This pattern did not die with the Treaty of Versailles. It mutated. By the time the Second World War began in 1939, the machinery was already in place, refined by 2 decades of experience. And this time, the scale was so vast so deeply woven into the fabric of industrial capitalism that it became almost impossible to separate legitimate defense from profiteering. The United States government spent approximately $340 billion on the war between 1941 and 1945. That money did not disappear into the air. It flowed through contracts to General Motors, Boeing, Raytheon, Standard Oil, IBM, and hundreds of other corporations. IBM, specifically, deserves a moment of your full attention. While American politicians spoke of fighting fascism, IBM's German subsidiary, Dehomag, continued operating throughout the war under a complex arrangement that allowed the American parent company to maintain effective control while avoiding direct legal liability. IBM punch card technology was used by the Nazi regime to organize census data, to track populations, to manage the logistics of what would become the Holocaust. Edwin Black documented this in forensic detail in his 2001 book, War Against the Weak, and in his earlier work, IBM and the Holocaust. The technology did not pull any triggers, but it made the machinery of industrialized murder more efficient. And IBM's stock price recovered just fine after 1945. This is not ancient history wearing a costume. The architecture that was built during those wars is the same architecture that operates today, updated with better software and more sophisticated legal structures. The modern defense industry is a $2 trillion a year global market. The 5 largest defense contractors in the world, Lockheed Martin, Raytheon Technologies, Boeing Defense, Northrop Grumman, and General Dynamics, collectively receive hundreds of billions in government contracts every single year. Their revenue streams are, by design, recession-proof. Economic downturns that devastate other industries tend to increase defense budgets, not decrease them. When tension rises in a region, analysts on Wall Street don't just report on it. They trade on it. On the morning of September 11, 2001, before the second tower had fallen, unusual options activity in airline stocks and defense contractor shares was already being noted by market surveillance systems. Investigations into that activity were eventually absorbed into the broader 9/11 Commission inquiry and largely set aside. Whether that activity represented foreknowledge, coincidence, or something in between has never been definitively established. What is beyond dispute is that in the weeks and months that followed, defense stocks surged. Lockheed Martin's share price rose significantly. Raytheon, which manufactures the Tomahawk cruise missiles that would be fired in large quantities in the years to come, saw its stock climb steadily. By 2003, with 2 wars underway, the defense sector was among the best performing segments of the entire American stock market. Not everyone who profited had any advanced knowledge of anything. That is the most disturbing part. The system is designed so that you don't need to know. You just need to be positioned. A pension fund manager in Ohio, who had holdings in a broad defense index fund, profited from those wars alongside the executives at the top. The diffusion of benefit is one of the most effective ways a morally uncomfortable arrangement maintains political stability. When enough people are making money, the number of people asking hard questions decreases proportionally. This same dynamic plays out in smaller, less visible ways that rarely make international headlines. When civil conflict erupts in a resource-rich developing nation, the immediate consequence is human suffering on a scale that is difficult to comprehend from a distance. The secondary consequence, measured in the financial press, is movement in commodity markets. Cobalt prices shift when the Democratic Republic of Congo experiences political instability. Oil futures move when shipping lanes near conflict zones become uncertain. Agricultural commodity markets respond to droughts that are worsened by the destruction of irrigation infrastructure during wartime. Each of these movements represents both a humanitarian catastrophe and a financial opportunity, and the two things exist simultaneously without apparent contradiction in the minds of the people who trade them. The arms trade itself operates through a system of government licenses, back channels, and third-party intermediaries that make direct accountability almost impossible to establish. Victor Bout, the Russian arms dealer who was eventually arrested and imprisoned before being released in a prisoner exchange in 2022, was for years a kind of living illustration of how this system functions at its edges. He supplied weapons to governments and rebel groups across Africa and the Middle East, often with the tacit knowledge of multiple intelligence services who found him useful. His story was dramatic enough to become a film, but the men who ran legal arms brokering operations through registered companies in EU member states, supplying weapons to conflicts across the globe with full government authorization, those men gave interviews at think tanks and served on corporate boards. The line between legal and illegal in the arms trade is not a moral line. It is an administrative one. Saudi Arabia, to take one example that has been extensively documented by investigative journalists and human rights organizations, has been the largest customer of American and British arms manufacturers for years. Between 2015 and 2022, the United States approved more than $60 billion in arms sales to Riyadh. During that same period, Saudi-led coalition airstrikes in Yemen killed thousands of civilians and created what United Nations officials described as one of the worst humanitarian catastrophes in the world. The cluster munitions and precision-guided bombs used in some of those strikes were manufactured in the United States. The contracts that produced them were signed in Washington and approved by administrations of both major political parties. The weapons were legal. The profits were real. The children were dead. None of this is hidden. It is public record. The congressional notifications of those arms sales were published in official government documents. The financial filings of the defense contractors reported the revenues. The journalists who covered the Yemen war filed their dispatches from field hospitals and rubble. All of this information existed simultaneously in the same world, and the system continued to function because the people who benefit from its continuation are, almost without exception, the same people who have the power to change it. There is a concept in economics called externalities. An externality is a cost or benefit that is experienced by parties who are not directly involved in a transaction. Pollution is the classic example. A factory produces goods, sells them at a profit, and the cost of the pollution it generates is borne by the surrounding community, not reflected in the price of the goods. War, viewed through this lens, is perhaps the greatest externality machine ever invented. The financial gains are concentrated, measurable, and flow to identifiable institutions. The costs, the deaths, the displacement, the generational trauma, the destroyed infrastructure, the poisoned land, are diffuse, often incalculable, and fall almost entirely on people who had no seat at any table where any decision was made. This imbalance is not an accident. It is a structural feature, and it has proven remarkably resistant to change, not because the people within the system are uniquely evil, but because the incentives are so powerful and so broadly distributed that challenging them requires a level of coordinated political will that has, so far in human history, never been sustained long enough to matter. Reform movements rise after every major war. Declarations are made, committees are formed, books are written. And then, gradually, the next procurement cycle begins, the next regional tension flares, and the calculus reasserts itself with the quiet inevitability of compound interest. The question that stays with you, after you have looked at all of this clearly, is not whether this system can be justified. It cannot. The question is simpler and more uncomfortable than that. The question is who, exactly, is in a position to end it, and what would they have to give up to do so?